In the spring of 1851, the settlement growing up around the confluence of the Des Moines and Raccoon Rivers was barely 5 years removed from being a military post. Fort Des Moines had stood there since 1843, built under Captain James Allen to garrison a stretch of central Iowa during the final years of Sauk and Meskwaki presence in the region, before treaty terms pushed both nations west into Kansas. The Dragoon Regiment stationed there spent most of its short existence keeping an uneasy peace during the years leading up to that removal, a deadline set by the 1842 treaty and largely completed by 1845, rather than fighting any organized campaign. The river itself carried a name whose origin historians still argue over, whether it came from French traders' word for monks, moines, tied to a since-vanished mission near its mouth, or from a corruption of Moingona, an Algonquian-derived name for the people who lived along its banks long before any Frenchman wrote it down. When the soldiers left in 1846, the fort's log buildings became the first structures of a civilian town, and settlers filed onto land that had been native ground within living memory of people still alive to remember losing it, a transfer of ownership measured in years rather than the generations later histories sometimes imply. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. By 1851, the young town had a plat, a few hundred residents, a general store, a sawmill working the timber along the riverbanks, and the beginnings of a newspaper, all clustered close to the water because the water was the reason the town existed in the first place. It was the easiest route for supplies coming up from the Mississippi, a source of power for the mill, and a boundary that made the surveyor's job simple when the original town plat was laid out. Fields of corn and wheat pushed right up against both banks, because the bottomland was the richest ground anyone had, dark alluvial soil built up over centuries of exactly the kind of flooding nobody yet wanted to think too hard about. Polk County itself had only been organized a few years earlier, carved out of the surrounding territory once the fort's native occupants were gone, and the town at its center was still working out the basic institutions a settlement needed: a post office, a rudimentary court, a school taught out of whatever building could be spared. Growth in those first 5 years was steady rather than explosive, the kind of incremental expansion typical of a river town waiting to see whether it would become a genuine regional center or simply one of dozens of similar crossroads settlements scattered across the new state. The settlers had come from places, Ohio, Indiana, the eastern states, where rivers behaved with a predictability built on generations of local memory. Iowa, in 1851, offered no such inheritance. The state itself was only 5 years old. Most families along the Des Moines had been there less than a decade, and almost none of them had watched this particular stretch of water long enough to know what it could do in a truly bad year. What they lacked in inherited memory, the land itself still held, if anyone had known where to look. The Iowa, whose name the state carries, had lived along these rivers for generations before any survey line touched the ground, moving between fixed village sites and hunting territory, building earthen lodges on the same terraces above the floodplain that stayed dry when the lower bottomland did not, and returning seasonally to favored sites along the river junction where fish, timber, and fertile planting ground all sat within easy reach of one another. Village locations shifted gradually over time, as they generally did for river-oriented communities managing soil fertility and resource availability across many generations, but the high ground at a confluence like this one, offering visibility, drainage, and access to two waterways at once, remained a consistently attractive place to settle across a very long span of that occupation, long before it became attractive to the United States Army, for exactly the same practical reasons. The Meskwaki and Sauk, pushed into Iowa across earlier decades of pressure from the east, had shared and contested much of the same river geography before the 1842 treaty forced their removal, a process largely finished by the time the fort at the river junction was decommissioned. Longer before either of those nations arrived in the historical record kept by the United States government, an even older set of communities, people archaeologists now group loosely under the woodland period, had built low earthen mounds along the same bluffs and terraces, structures meant to hold their dead across many generations, set into precisely the kind of high, dry, river-adjacent ground that would later attract fort builders and farmers for exactly the same practical reasons. Most of the settlers breaking new ground for corn in 1851 had no idea what the low rises scattered across some of their fields actually were. A number of them ploughed straight through those rises without a second thought. The rain that spring did not arrive as a single storm. It came as a pattern, week after week through April and into May, soaking ground that never fully dried between downpours. By late May, the Des Moines and the Raccoon were both running well above anything the young town had witnessed. The two rivers meet directly at the site of the settlement, which meant a serious rise on either one put pressure on the town from two directions at once, and in the spring of 1851, both rivers rose together. Accounts written by settlers in the years afterward, and the early state histories compiled from surviving letters, diaries, and newspaper fragments, described the flood as the worst the region had experienced since organized settlement began, a judgment that carried weight, even given how short that measuring period still was. Water came up out of its banks and across bottomland fields planted only weeks earlier. Corn that had just broken the soil went under. Cabins built close to the water, which described most of them, took on water at their floors, and several were undermined at their foundations where the current cut into the soft, saturated soil beneath. Livestock had to be moved to higher ground in a hurry, not always successfully. The rough roads connecting the settlement to the outside world became impassable at almost the exact moment supplies were most urgently needed. Whatever informal